It was supposed to be a short strategic check-in. The calendar invite came through at exactly 9:42 p.m. the night before. No subject beyond the cold and cryptic vision and future alignment. That was already unusual. Dylan never sent messages after hours, unless a major client had threatened to walk, or a campaign flopped in real time. I stared at the glowing subject line for a long minute, trying to shake off the quiet hum of dread that settled in my chest. I'd been with Arlo and Finch for 18 years, joined when the company was still a handful of desks in a co-working space above a Chinese restaurant. My official title was Head of Brand Strategy, but over the years, I'd become so much more. Crisis fixer, cultural anchor, mentor, counselor, firewall. I'd seen us through 3 rebrands, 2 acquisitions, a viral disaster, and the pandemic pivot. I'd built my department from a team of 2 interns and an underqualified analyst into a powerhouse that handled multi-million-dollar campaigns. My work, our work, had defined the company's public identity. So when I saw the invite, I didn't expect disaster. I expected maybe a shakeup, possibly even a promotion. After all, I'd just led our most successful product launch in 5 years. The conference room I stepped into the next morning didn't feel right. It was too sterile, too quiet. The chairs were perfectly aligned, the coffee untouched. Dylan sat at the head of the table in a charcoal gray suit that made him look more Wall Street than startup visionary. To his left sat Margaret from HR, flipping absently through a manila folder, and beside her, someone new. A woman I'd never seen before, early 30s, if that. Impeccably dressed, long dark hair that curled neatly at her shoulders, blood-red manicure that matched her lips. She didn't smile, didn't offer a hand. She just looked at me like I was something she intended to dissect. "Georgia," Dylan said, with that forced brightness executives use before they gut you. "Thanks for making time. This won't take long." I took the seat they offered. I didn't touch the coffee. "We've been reevaluating our leadership structures," Dylan began, clasping his hands like a pastor delivering bad news wrapped in gospel. "Looking at where we're headed, the kinds of agility we need, the energy we want to infuse into the next phase." Every word was another match, flicked casually at the dry grass beneath my feet. "This is Milana," he said, finally gesturing to the woman beside him. "She'll be taking over your position starting Monday." My brain struggled to assemble meaning. Milana. No last name offered, no credentials, no justification, just Milana. "We really appreciate your contributions over the years," Margaret piped in quickly, a little too rehearsed. "And we'll be providing transition support over the next 2 weeks." I stared at Dylan, then at Milana, then back again. Nothing, no apology, no gratitude, not even the decency of pretense. And in that moment, something inside me crystallized. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 18 years settle into my spine. "Thank you for the clarity," I said. My voice was calm, my hands steady. "Best of luck." And I walked out. No one followed me. No one called after me. The door clicked softly shut behind me. Back in my office, my space, still mine, for a few more hours. I moved on autopilot. The sun slanted across the carpet. My name still glinted on the brass plaque outside the door. The photos on the shelf showed a younger version of me, surrounded by the team I'd built. The award wall shimmered faintly, a shrine to effort and results no one in that room had cared about. I sat down at my desk. The air felt different now, like the building itself was holding its breath. I packed in silence. My notebooks, the mug with the faded company logo and the chipped handle, the hand-signed card from the 10-year anniversary party, the printout of the thank you email from the CEO of Luxor, the campaign we landed against impossible odds. And then my phone rang. Unknown number. For a second, I almost let it go. But something made me answer. "Georgia Wells?" The voice was sharp, poised. A woman, not one I recognized. "Yes," I said carefully. "My name is Ilna Torres. I've followed your work for years. We haven't met, but I've admired your approach to brand integrity. I blinked. My hands stilled. I know this is abrupt, she continued, but I understand you may be in transition. I have an offer I believe you'll want to hear. Something that could redefine the next chapter for both of us. What kind of offer? There was a pause. A deliberate one. Let's just say I'm in acquisition, and I've been waiting for the right moment. I hear you're available. Something in her voice sent a spark up my spine. I sat back in my chair slowly, the phone still to my ear, the boxed memories of 18 years staring back at me. I'm listening, I said, and in that quiet, electric moment, everything began to change. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been a ghost that never quite visited. I lay in bed listening to the rhythm of traffic beyond my window and the occasional bark of a restless city dog. My fingers twitched for a task, some sense of normalcy. Emails to scan, reports to finalize, a team chat pinging in the background. But there was nothing, just the silence of being abruptly unmoored. I dressed with mechanical precision. Black blazer, pressed jeans, low heels, and drove toward a part of town I hadn't set foot in for years. Richie Cameron's office sat in a restored brick warehouse by the river, sleek and understated, like everything Haven plus West touched. The company had once been a joke, a small branding firm with big ideas and no traction, but under Richie's leadership, it became our biggest rival. And now, possibly, my escape hatch. The receptionist greeted me with a nod and a polite smile. He's waiting in conference 3. Waiting, not hiding behind HR, not delegating, waiting. I walked into the room, heart steady, chin high, and there he was. Richie looked exactly like I remembered from industry panels. Tall, lean, crisp in his shirt sleeves, no tie. A man who built his empire through charm, instinct, and an uncanny ability to predict where the market was headed 5 minutes before everyone else. "Georgia," he said warmly, standing and offering his hand. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't think you'd reach out this fast," I replied, taking the seat across from him. "I didn't think they'd be that stupid," he said without missing a beat. A laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Not a big one, but the first in days. He leaned forward. "I meant what I said. You were the backbone of Arlo and Finch's credibility. They didn't just lose an employee. They lost the engine that built their reputation." I nodded slowly. "I was told they needed someone younger, more agile, with fresh energy." "Ah, yes," Richie said, his voice dry. "Nothing screams innovation like nepotism." That made me laugh for real. The kind of laugh that hurt a little because of how much I needed it. He didn't waste time. "We want you," he said. "Not as a consultant, not as a director. We want you at the top of a new division, complete autonomy, your team, your hires, your strategy." I blinked. What division? He smiled, but it was the smile of someone already 2 moves ahead. "We're building a shadow brand, something lean, disruptive, outside the current structure but fueled by our core insights. I want you to lead it. We've already got the seed clients. The funding is locked. We just need someone who knows how to think 10 steps ahead and who's spent long enough being underestimated." My breath caught. I should have asked for time to think, to review numbers, to call a lawyer. But instead, I said, "When do we start?" "Monday," Richie replied. "But you'll want to see what we have first." He handed me a folder. Inside were the initial briefs, 3 major companies looking to reposition, one of them a former Arlo and Finch client we'd lost 2 years ago due to internal politics. "You can take them back," I said before I realized my tone had hardened. He just raised an eyebrow. "I'm not stealing anything. These clients came to us. They're asking for something Arlo and Finch can't deliver anymore. Authenticity." I exhaled slowly, the folder warm in my lap. For the first time, the ache in my chest shifted into something else. Resolve. "I'll build you something better," I said. "Not just faster or cheaper, better, real." That's exactly what I was counting on. I left his office with a packet in my hand and a storm in my blood. By the time I drove home, the last traces of yesterday's grief had hardened into a mission. They replaced me with the CEO's sister. Now I was going to replace the company, one client at a time, one truth at a time, one brilliant, unignorable idea at a time. I arrived at Haven Plus West just before 10 a.m., the river still cloaked in fog behind the gleaming windows. My mind was a battlefield of instincts, half of them urging caution, the other half vibrating with a quiet thrill I hadn't felt in years. The front desk buzzed me up without ceremony. I stepped into the elevator with a man I vaguely recognized from a panel years ago. He gave a courteous nod, said nothing. The building was filled with people who moved like they were already part of the future. No posturing, no hollow cheerfulness, just focus, energy, momentum. And I was about to ride right into its center. Richie was already in conference room 7 when I arrived, sipping black coffee and scrolling through something on his tablet. He looked up, smile soft, but unmistakably serious. "Georgia," he said, "glad you came." I sat down at the wide walnut table and placed my bag beside me. I expected a welcome, a few outlines of next steps, maybe a slideshow, something digestible. Instead, he pushed a sealed manila envelope across the table toward me. I stared at it. "What is this?" "Open it," he said, like it was obvious. I peeled back the flap, fingers suddenly too aware of themselves. Inside was a slim stack of papers, legal documents, M&A summaries, timelines. And then, my breath caught, an internal transition plan labeled with a name I hadn't expected to see again so soon. Arlo and Finch, Executive Realignment Proposal. I read it twice before I looked back up at him. "You're buying them," Richie nodded slowly. "Yes." I let out a single disbelieving breath, part laugh, part recoil. "You're acquiring Arlo and Finch?" He met my eyes, completely unfazed. "The deal's not public yet, but it's already in motion. Their capital structure is brittle. Investors are losing patience. A few quiet offers, a nudge here, a rumor there, and suddenly the board wants out. It's happening, Georgia, and soon." The air in the room thinned. I stood up and walked slowly to the window, papers in hand, the city spread out below me in pale gray layers. "You want to absorb them?" "We're not just absorbing," Richie said. "We're realigning. Their brand has value. Their bones still have structure. What they lack is leadership. What they lost was you." I turned to face him again. "So what? What exactly are you offering me?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice steady. "We want you to run it." I blinked. "Run! Arlo and Finch." "Temporarily," he clarified. "As interim head, you'd go in under our banner, take the reins, stabilize operations, clean house where necessary, and prep it for full integration or rebrand." My head shook slowly, trying to reject what my heart had already started to absorb. "You want me to go back, to the same office that fired me 2 weeks ago, to the same board that didn't even have the decency to say goodbye?" "Yes," he said simply. I stared at him, flabbergasted. Why would I ever agree to that? Richie didn't rush. He waited. Then he said, with deliberate calm, "Because you didn't leave that company. They left you, and you're still carrying something they forgot how to hold. Vision." The silence after that sentence felt like a third person in the room. He stood up then and walked to the credenza, where he poured a second coffee, handed it to me, and spoke again. Softly this time. "This isn't revenge, Georgia. This isn't about gloating or proving anyone wrong. It's about building something right. You know their systems. You know where the rot is. But more importantly, you still know what it could be. You can turn it around, not because they deserve you, but because you deserve the chance to finish what you started." I sat back down, coffee untouched. My eyes scanned the document again. Dylan's name was missing. Milana was nowhere to be found. The restructuring plan looked like a war map. Departments merging, budgets reallocated, entire teams dissolved or reassigned. But there, On the final page was a simple, powerful line. Interim CEO, Georgia Wells. Approval pending final signature. My name. My role. I swallowed hard. I don't want to be a puppet for your acquisition, I said. If I do this, I do it with autonomy. Total control of the executive team. Final say on staffing. No interference, Desat. Richie smiled. Not with amusement, but with respect. Of course. That's why we chose you. And that was the moment it shifted. The grief, the humiliation, the ache of being discarded. It all condensed into something sharp, something clean. Purpose. I'll need a week to prepare, I said. You've got 4 days, he replied. I laughed despite myself. Of course I do. By the time I left the building, the fog had lifted over the river. My phone buzzed with an unread message, Margaret from HR at Arlo and Finch. A strangely courteous tone. We'd like to schedule an executive transition discussion. I stared at it. Then I deleted it. They didn't know it yet, but I wouldn't be the one attending their meeting. I'd be the one leading it. The elevator chimed with its usual soft ding as I arrived at the sublevel. The air was cooler down here, heavier somehow, like the past itself was still stored in the walls. The archive room. Few people ever visited it. It was where paper went to die, or be quietly buried. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here because something had been clawing at the back of my mind ever since Richie showed me those merger documents. A clause. One I wrote years ago, barely remembered, but that now pulsed like a beacon beneath the surface of my memory. Clause 47B. The name had floated into my thoughts during a late-night prep session. I hadn't been entirely sure it was real. It had been part of a set of internal merger protocols for a proposed acquisition of a boutique brand consultancy, Project Raven. The deal never happened, but the legal frameworks we built for it? We'd been meticulous. I found the old physical files in the back corner of the room, third cabinet from the left. The drawers were still labeled in my handwriting, tight, deliberate pen strokes from a version of me that used to believe legacy protected you. I pulled open the drawer. Project Raven. I stared at the file like it was a time capsule. Inside were pages of operational assessments, integration risks, compliance blueprints. And then, halfway through a battered folder, there it was. A stapled printout. My initials scribbled in the corner. Clause 47B. Executive Oversight Provision for Strategic Realignment. My eyes locked onto the first paragraph. In the event of an internal or external acquisition, executive leadership tenured 15 years or more and recognized as primary author of brand or structural strategy shall retain final advisory control over transitional alignment, including, but not limited to, staffing, vision, contract retention, and implementation approvals. My heart stilled. I kept reading. This provision shall remain valid unless rescinded through a formal board vote with no fewer than 66% of legacy board members in attendance, and with supporting legal notice delivered to said executive no less than 90 days prior to transaction finalization. I blinked. There had been no vote, no notice, no rescission. The clause was still active, legally, which meant I still had control. Not just moral leverage, not just historical claim, actual binding control over the merger. I sank onto the edge of a metal chair, the document trembling slightly in my hands. A slow breath worked its way through my lungs, cold and metallic. This wasn't just paperwork, this was power. I thought back to the night I drafted the clause. It had been after another sleepless week, during a chaotic merger workshop. The junior legal associate had flagged a risk. What if the strategic lead got replaced mid-transition? What if their knowledge vanished with them? I remembered looking up from the whiteboard, bleary-eyed but sharp, and saying, "We need a clause, something ironclad. Vision can't be orphaned." The legal team had agreed, and I wrote it myself, and now they had forgotten it, or ignored it, or, more likely, assumed no one would ever look that far back. But I had, because I knew this company's bones better than anyone. I stood, grabbed the file, and locked the cabinet behind me. As I rode the elevator back up to the executive floor, the one they hadn't dared reassign yet, I watched my reflection in the mirrored walls. Same face, same eyes. But something was different now. They thought they'd replaced me with the CEO's sister and a clean PR statement. But what they didn't understand was that I'd built the floor they were standing on, and hidden in its foundation was the legal equivalent of a detonator. Back in my new office, the temporary transition suite, I spread out the documents across the desk. Clause 47B, the Haven plus West merger outline. Richie's proposal, a trinity of power. The phone on the desk rang once. I didn't answer it. Instead, I opened a blank page on my laptop and began drafting a memo. To Richie Cameron. Subject: Clause 47B enforcement. Immediate strategic implications. And then I started writing the plan. Because the truth was, I hadn't come back just to close a circle. I'd come back to redraw it entirely. Sunday morning began with the flicker of sunlight cutting through half-drawn curtains and the sharp taste of espresso I didn't remember brewing. My laptop screen glowed against the cluttered mess of paper, sticky notes, and 2 nearly drained pens. The clock said 7:12 a.m., but I couldn't recall when I'd last slept. I wasn't tired, I was possessed. The plan was no longer just an outline, it was alive. I had spent the last 48 hours buried in internal systems, legal documents, archived SOPs, and printouts I had dug from both Haven plus West's vault and the Arlo and Finch archives. Every page I turned was another breadcrumb, leading me back to one impossible truth. I had built more of this company than I remembered. The foundation was mine. The systems, the frameworks, the patterns, they weren't just inspired by me. They were me. The onboarding flow for brand clients? I wrote the draft for that when we still shared a printer with an insurance startup. The content escalation chart? I created it on a plane between Portland and Chicago after a social post went sideways and our team had no plan to recover. The mentorship tree? That started because one of our interns was crying in the stairwell from imposter syndrome, and I realized no one had thought to design human infrastructure in the growth model. Now, 12 years later, it was all still there. Used, reworded, misattributed, but unmistakably mine. They'd gutted the leadership, but left the plumbing intact. Like evicting the architect, but never changing the locks. I found a binder labeled Quarterly Evolution Labs, a soft launch program I'd started for creative experimentation. The initiative had once been dismissed by Dylan as not scalable. Now it was rebranded as Vision Pods, under Milana's leadership, complete with a logo she'd clearly paid an agency to create. And then there was the strategy matrix, color-coded, methodical, methodologically bulletproof. I ran my finger down the column headers. The names had changed, but the structure, it hadn't. It was still my skeleton, even if they'd tried to dress it in someone else's clothes. By the time dusk settled on Sunday, I had made a list, not of revenge targets, not of enemies, but of witnesses. People who remembered. People who had once built beside me before being pushed out for not being new enough. I started with 5 names. Sarah Lynn, former UX director. Fired during a streamlining initiative after pushing back against outsourcing design to a firm that barely understood our brand language. Last I heard, she was working out of Copenhagen, consulting for AI-led product interfaces. Paul Gardner, senior data strategist. Left voluntarily, disillusioned. Once called a quiet genius with no ego, which meant he was doomed in a room full of executives who couldn't read a bar graph without animation. Marisol Vega, customer insights lead. Reassigned to a team in name only after winning us the Luxor pivot. When she left, no one even held a farewell lunch. Darren Liu, developer, hybrid systems guy. The man who once stayed up with me till 3 a.m., debugging a back-end issue because I was too proud to tell the client we'd made a mistake. He walked out quietly when his project was given to an intern with a portfolio and a TikTok account. And then, Alex Monroe. Alex had been my right hand, trusted, thoughtful, strategic in the way that didn't demand attention, but created ripples behind every campaign. He had taken the fall more than once for executive missteps and never asked for anything in return. I lost him the day he stopped believing in redemption. I reached out to each of them. No fluff, no pitch decks. Subject, what we built still matters. By Sunday night, they'd all replied, and every message hurt in a different way. Sarah, I thought they burned it all down. I'm in. Paul, name the time, just don't make me use Teams again. Marisol, Georgia, I've been waiting for this email for 2 years. Darren, if we're fixing the house we were kicked out of, I'll bring the tools. Alex, took longer, almost 24 hours. But when his reply finally came, it was only 5 words. Tell me where we start. I sat at my dining table, laptop open, coffee cold beside me. The air was thick with something that felt like purpose and the first breath of long suppressed rage. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a resurrection. We would rebuild, not just the systems or the brand, but the soul of what we'd created before it was stolen, misnamed, and sold back to us as someone else's innovation. I clicked open a new document, titled it simply, Phase 1, Foundation Audit, and began writing, Executive Infrastructure Review, Legacy Systems Analysis, Team Rebuild Protocol, Silent Influence Assessment, Cultural Narrative Reclamation, because they thought I was the past. But the truth? I'd always been the engine. And now I was bringing back the fire. The folder felt heavier than it should have. Not just physically, emotionally, like opening it would break something final. Margaret slid it toward me in the executive suite with a stiffness I couldn't ignore. Her mouth was tight, her eyes slightly too wide, like she wasn't sure if she was handing over a leadership chart or a detonator. This is the updated executive list, she said quietly. Roles, current contracts, and team oversight. Let me know if you need access to individual files. I nodded once, didn't thank her. She didn't expect me to. When she left, I turned the folder over slowly and opened it on the broad table in front of me. The rain outside softened the city skyline to a gray smudge. The room was still, too quiet for what I was about to do. There were 27 names on the list. I recognized most of them, some too well. I scanned the list once, then a second time, slower, letting every name hit with the force it deserved. Some hurt like punches, others were just background noise, and a few, too few, offered a flicker of something close to hope. I drew a hard line down the center of a legal pad and titled the columns the way a surgeon might label surgical margins. Retain, remove. This wasn't corporate downsizing. This was triage. Harrison Kane, Chief Creative Officer, once my protege. Smart, persuasive, beloved by the teams. But he'd stopped showing up to internal review boards months before I was pushed out. I remembered overhearing him once at a happy hour I wasn't invited to. Georgia's too cautious. The market's changing. We need fire, not finesse. He had never said that to my face. I drew a red slash across his name. Priya Desai, VP, Client Relations. This one hurt more than I expected. We'd pulled all-nighters on product turnarounds, split hotel rooms at summits, cried together after that first failed campaign in 13. And yet, when I was cut out of the leadership thread, when my name disappeared from the org chart, she went radio silent. She'd signed Milana's appointment letter. Black ink, clean margin, gone. Lila Trent, head of innovation. A revolving door of lofty ideas and no execution. She made visionary her brand, but couldn't manage a 10-minute sprint meeting. She once called data inhibiting. I'd kept her because Dylan liked her. Now she was unprotected, gone. Arman Sethi, digital strategy, bright, ambitious, and a thief. He'd taken my deck, a 41-page color-coded strategy doc I'd spent weeks building, and swapped my name for Milana's in the attribution line. It was the deck that had landed us the Ferrano account. He didn't just lie, he buried me. Gone. I flipped the page to Krista Bell, Associate Director, Product Strategy. Younger, newer. I remembered her shaking hands, always careful, always kind. She'd once left a note on my desk during a product collapse. Thanks for believing in my weird ideas. I still did. Keep, Javier Lin, compliance, never loud, never political. But when we were under fire during the Luxor supply chain scandal, it was Javier who stayed up rewriting the code of ethics in 2 languages, while legal panicked. Keep, Nadia Kim, finance. She'd sent me a message the morning after I was dismissed. This wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't vote yes. It was the only honest sentence I'd seen that week. Keep. I reached Martin Roth, operations, hired 6 months ago, new, efficient, if a little stiff, too fresh to have betrayed me, no signs of rot, yet, provisional, circled, name after name after name. Some didn't need lines. They had erased themselves. Others lingered. Half-remembered colleagues who had slid into silence when I'd needed truth most. And then I hit a name that stopped me cold. Alex Monroe, Director of Integrated Strategy. My breath caught. He wasn't on the active roster. That wasn't surprising. I knew he'd left 6 months ago. But seeing his name, printed here in tiny font on an older roster page clipped to the back, felt like a ghost tugging at my sleeve. The margin beside his name was blank. No notes, no reassignment. Just silence. He had left before I was pushed out, and I told myself it wasn't personal. But maybe it had been. Maybe he'd seen the iceberg before I did and quietly swam to shore. But he had answered my email. He'd said 5 words. Tell me where we start. I closed the folder. This wasn't just about role reassignments or restructuring. It was about trust. And so I made a new list on a blank sheet of paper. Not who stayed silent, but why it wasn't enough to purge. I needed to understand the root. Who had turned? Who had frozen in place? And who had done the unthinkable, moved on like I never existed? The worst betrayal wasn't active sabotage. It was abandonment. Leadership, I realized, wasn't about protecting the top of the pyramid. It was about knowing which stones underneath were still holding weight, and which were quietly crumbling. I stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling whiteboard, and began writing names in different colors. Blue for the loyal, red for the compromised, gray for the unknowns, green for those who might come back. It looked like a war map, because it was. But this time, I wasn't retreating. I was drawing battle lines, with the clarity of someone who had already bled and survived it. And as I capped the marker and looked at the board, I said it out loud. This time, we build it clean. The automatic glass doors opened just as they always had, smooth, quiet, indifferent. But everything was different now. I wasn't walking in as an employee. I wasn't even a guest. I was a legal representative of the acquiring entity. My role wasn't printed on a business card. It didn't need to be. Clause 47B had already spoken for me. So had Richie. And now, the law was merely catching up to what was already inevitable. The lobby looked exactly the same. Gray stone tiles, understated gold accents, the massive logo still looming behind reception like it meant something. It didn't. Not anymore. I nodded once to the receptionist. She blinked in recognition, hesitated, then stood as if by instinct. I didn't stop. I didn't need directions. I knew every inch of this place. I rode the elevator in silence, alone. As the floor numbers climbed, I watched my reflection in the brushed steel panel. Same posture, same eyes, but a different woman, stronger, sharper, unshakable. The doors opened to the executive floor, my floor once, and for a second, the air itself seemed to pause. Conversations down the corridor dimmed. I felt heads turn without looking, some subtle, some brazen. I didn't stop. Each step forward was an act of reclamation. I passed the creative suite where I had once built launch campaigns that changed the trajectory of our revenue by millions. Past the boardroom where Dylan had once told me I was the center of gravity. Past the break room where I'd stood during layoff announcements, holding the weight of everyone's unspoken panic. Then I saw her, Milana, standing by the coffee machine, laughing into a phone. Her perfectly blown-out hair fell around her shoulders like a magazine cover. Her back was turned at first. Then she turned, froze, and saw me. For a second, just 1 second, I watched it register. Recognition, disbelief, a flicker of something darker. Fear? Maybe. Or maybe just the awareness that the game had changed and she wasn't holding the dice anymore. I didn't look at her twice. No eye contact, no words, just forward. Silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I reached the large conference room at the end of the hallway. Margaret and 2 legal reps were already seated inside, papers arranged, small talk half-hearted. "Ms. Wells," one of the attorneys said, standing. I gave a brief nod. "Let's begin." The negotiation table was long, lacquered, and cold under my fingers. My copy of Clause 47B sat in front of me, highlighted and annotated. Beside it, Richie's merger timeline, marked with confidential observations and notes he had insisted I deliver in person. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to inform. The moment I placed the clause on the table, the tone changed. The older legal rep, Harold, a man I remembered from acquisition training sessions, leaned forward, eyes scanning the document. He squinted. Then his lips parted slightly. "You wrote this?" "Yes," I said calmly. 12 years ago." He leaned back slowly, nodding once, like someone watching a chess piece fall in slow motion. The silence in the room shifted from tension to calculation. Margaret opened her mouth once, closed it again. I continued. "I am acting under full authority granted by legal provision 47B, as well as formal interim executive status granted by the primary acquiring entity. You are not here to decide if I have a seat at this table. You are here to accept that I now chair it." More silence. No one challenged me because they couldn't. Outside the glass walls, I caught a glimpse of movement. Milana, pacing near the design wing, speaking animatedly to someone, her eyes darting toward the conference room every few seconds. Let her pace. Let her guess. Let her sweat. I didn't come to gloat. I came to rewrite everything. By the time the meeting ended, 3 executives had scheduled private check-ins with my assistant. 2 legal teams requested extended review time. And Margaret, well, she avoided my gaze until the end. As I gathered my documents and rose to leave, she spoke quietly. "You always were 3 moves ahead." I paused at the door, just for a second. Then I said, without turning, "No, I was always the one playing the long game while everyone else chased applause." And then I walked out. The silence followed me like a shadow, but this time it wasn't lonely. It was mine. The document shouldn't have been in my hands. It arrived in a batch of transfer files, paper-thin folders, all cream-colored and identical, stamped with project tags and legal markers. I had been reviewing an audit summary when a single misfiled attachment caught my eye. Tucked inside a transition brief was a stapled email chain, printed hastily, the pages still warm from the copier. The subject line, "Client Status, Q2, Retention Analysis, Internal Only." It was never meant for me. I flipped through the first page and immediately knew this wasn't routine. There was a nervousness in the writing, a frantic undercurrent barely hidden beneath the corporate phrasing. "Please flag Verity as high risk. They've requested full cancellation terms and paused comms until further notice. Luxor has gone quiet. No response since the last deliverable review. Milana overrode the final approval and changed the entire structure last minute. Client was furious. Blue Grid filed for early exit. Notes say leadership called us chaotic." Each paragraph hit like a dropped weight. These weren't casual drop-offs or typical seasonal churn. These were implosions. I scanned the headers. Dozens of names looped into panicked replies. Account managers, junior brand leads, project coordinators, all trying to plug holes in a ship that had begun to sink from its own arrogance. And one name came up in every thread. Milana. She was everywhere and nowhere in the threads. Approving things without context. Ghosting meetings. reversing decisions made by seasoned teams, rewriting entire creative narratives based on instinct. There was one note from a junior strategist that chilled me with its brutal honesty. She talks like a visionary, but edits like someone who's never seen a campaign past the pitch deck. There it was. The truth in one sentence. I leaned back in my chair, the document resting on my lap, my pulse calm, eerily so. This was what happened when ego took the wheel and told experience to sit in the back seat, when leadership was treated like a performance instead of a responsibility. This was what they had chosen over me, and now it was catching up with them. I watched, did nothing, not out of malice, but intention. There was no need to interfere, no need to send warnings or organize frantic triage calls. The systems they ignored were now unspooling before them, quietly, precisely, like an old thread pulled too far. The warning signs were everywhere. Internal Slack messages, snippets I was still privy to, filled with oblique references. Has anyone seen the new Q3 rollout plan? It's confusing. Anyone else notice the brand voice keeps changing every week? Are we supposed to still be doing weekly metrics, or did that stop when Georgia left? The house was still standing, but the foundation was rotting, and everyone could smell it. I found another email, this one particularly sharp. It was from the Luxor account lead to the CEO of Arlo & Finch, marked confidential but clearly desperate. We no longer recognize your brand or your leadership. Our team feels like we're engaging with a company that doesn't know who it is anymore. We are exploring alternate representation, effective immediately. There it was. They had built everything on sand the moment they let me go. And now the tide was coming in. Still, I said nothing. In the weekly leadership update with Richie, I didn't mention the file. I didn't share the emails. I didn't make a speech. Instead, I handed him a revised brand architecture proposal for the acquisition rollout, along with a cleaned-up operations flow for the post-merge phase. He raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You're very quiet about how bad it's getting over there." I met his gaze. "I don't need to say anything. They're doing the talking now." He nodded, smirked. "Let them." That night, I sat in my apartment, the city pulsing below, my phone lighting up with pings from old team members, former clients, even vendors. Some were frustrated, others were scared. All of them sounded the same. They were trying to make sense of a company that had lost its center. And I didn't offer them comfort, not yet. Instead, I waited. Because sometimes silence is sharper than fury. Sometimes letting the system fall under its own weight is the only way to make room for what's next. And when the dust finally settles, I'll be the one standing. Not because I clung to power, but because I never confused power with purpose. It was 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, when every inbox in the company lit up with the message. No fanfare, no dramatic subject line, just a standard notification header that said more than 1,000 speeches ever could. Subject: Executive Transition, Appointment of Acting CEO. The body of the email was brief, clinical, a masterpiece of corporate finality. Effective immediately, Georgia Wells will assume the role of Acting Chief Executive Officer of Arlo & Finch. This appointment follows the enforcement of Clause 47B and aligns with the transitional authority granted under the Strategic Acquisition Agreement with Haven West. All senior leadership will now report directly to Ms. Wells. Further operational directives will follow. There was no mention of Milana, no backstory, no explanation, just my name and my role. The reaction inside the building rippled like a silent quake. Some people froze mid-email. Others reread the announcement twice, 3 times, certain it had to be a formatting error. But the truth was unavoidable. I was no longer the woman they had quietly excused from leadership. I was now the one writing the map. When I arrived at the building, the front security guard, Tony, who had once slipped me extra visitor passes during pitch weeks, stood up straighter and offered a subtle nod. No words. Just quiet recognition. I passed through the lobby with the grace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times, and never quite like this. No badge, no clearance request, no checking in. I walked in as the highest-ranking person in the building. The elevator hummed as I ascended. I could feel the weight of every floor below me. Departments I had built, teams I had mentored, mistakes I had paid for with sleepless nights and public silence. And then the doors opened. The executive floor had changed in small, petty ways. New paint on the accent wall, a different brand of bottled water in the fridge, office signs that had been relabeled in a sleek but soulless font. But the energy? It was exactly as I remembered. Except now it belonged to me. People looked up as I passed. Some quickly dropped their eyes. A few nodded awkwardly. One or two smiled, a flicker of hope flashing in their expressions. I saw the message in their eyes. You're back, not just back, you're in charge. The walk to the main conference room was deliberate, not fast, not slow, but with a cadence that dared anyone to stop me. No one did. Through the glass walls, I could already see the senior leadership team waiting. Margaret, Javier, a few department heads who still hadn't decided if they were staying loyal to the old regime or pivoting to the future. I opened the door without knocking. They all stood. I didn't ask them to, they just did. Even Margaret. The room was painfully quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom or distraction, but the kind that only descends when something final has happened. Something undeniable. Margaret was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet but clear, almost reverent. Madam CEO. That was the first time I had ever heard it spoken aloud. It landed like a gavel. I stepped forward and set a slim leather folder on the table. Nothing fancy, just my preliminary operational directive and a list of departments due for audit. I looked around the room. The expressions were mixed, some skeptical, some relieved, some resigned. All of them were waiting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'm not here to correct the past. I'm here to fix the future. A pause. No one moved. This company has been drifting, not because it lacked talent, but because it lost its compass. That ends today. I opened the folder. Effective immediately, every department head will report to me. We will initiate a full cultural and operational audit within 72 hours. Departmental evaluations begin this afternoon. No exceptions. A flicker of unease moved through the room. I let it sit. Then I continued. If you're here to build, I welcome you. My eyes swept across their faces. If you're here to hide, leave now, because the next chapter will be written by people who remember why this place mattered in the first place. Still silence, but it wasn't resistance. It was respect. The real kind. Earned, not granted. Krista, sitting at the far end of the table, nodded once. Javier looked at me with something almost like pride. Margaret didn't say anything else, but her fingers moved slowly across her pen. I knew what it meant. She would stand beside me, or at least she wouldn't stand in the way. And as I stepped back from the table, closing the folder, I saw something shift. The room hadn't just accepted my return. It had surrendered to it. Not out of fear, but relief. Because I wasn't there to punish. I was there to restore. And deep down, they all knew. It was time. Time for the reckoning. Time for the rebuilding. Time for the one who had built it to return not as a ghost, or a footnote, or a cautionary tale, but as its future. The meetings began the next morning. No formal agenda, no assistants taking notes, no PR team crafting optics. Just me, one-on-one, behind a closed door, with the people who had chosen to stay. They filed in one by one, some confident, some cautious, some visibly anxious. Each brought their own version of the story, their justifications, their self-preserving rewrites of the past 6 months. I listened to every word, but I measured none of them by what they said, only by what they'd done. Priya Desai sat across from me with perfectly aligned posture, a silk blouse, and the same precise diction that had once helped us land impossible clients. She didn't offer excuses. She offered strategy. I stayed silent because I didn't think it would change anything, she said. That doesn't make it right. I'm not asking you to forget. Just let me help clean it up. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes gave her away. She knew what she'd traded. I nodded once. You have one project, 1 quarter, earn your way back. She exhaled like someone being let out of a very small cage. Harrison Kane came in next, wearing that too casual blazer, and just enough cologne to make it feel like he was still performing for someone. Georgia, he said with his signature grin. We've had our ups and downs, sure, but I always respected your work. I let him talk. He tried charm, tried spinning stories, tried distancing himself from Milana's disasters like he'd never clapped during her first speech. When he finished, I handed him a printout of his last 3 client reviews. I'm not here for respect, I said. I'm here for results. He left without another word. Christabel came in with a stack of her team's updated deliverables, unprompted. I've kept our systems going, quietly, because I thought one day you might come back. And if you did, I wanted you to know someone remembered how this place was built. I didn't say anything at first, just opened her documents and read through the KPIs she had tracked even after leadership stopped asking for them. I looked up. You were never invisible. Her eyes filled, just for a moment. That afternoon, I met with Darren, Marisol, and Paul, the ones I had called back from exile. Each had returned not for a paycheck or a title, but because they remembered what it felt like to build something real. They didn't ask for apologies or roles. They asked where to start. Those were the ones I trusted. Not the loudest. Not the ones with the best-sounding explanations, but the ones whose loyalty had stayed rooted in action, even if it had gone unseen. By the end of the week, I had finished 37 meetings. 15 offers were made. 9 roles were restructured. 3 desks were cleared out with quiet resignation and unspoken relief. I didn't gloat. I didn't punish. I simply decided. Because this time, leadership wasn't about taking power. It was about earning the right to carry it again. And as I stood in the center of my rebuilt office, sunlight stretching across the hardwood, my nameplate newly affixed to the door, I finally understood something I hadn't back when this story began. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing exactly where she belongs, surrounded by the echoes of everything they tried to erase, and choosing, deliberately, not to become what they were afraid she'd be. I didn't come back for revenge. I came back for the truth. And now, it was mine again. All of it. It was late afternoon when she appeared. Milana. She didn't knock. She just stood in the doorway of my office, backlit by the soft glare of the hallway sconces, her designer heels sinking slightly into the carpet as if the building itself no longer welcomed her weight. She looked different now, not messy, never that. But the edge was gone. The confidence that once clung to her like perfume had faded into something brittle. Her mouth twitched like she was searching for the right opening line. Georgia, she said finally, can we talk? I didn't respond. I didn't look up right away. I finished writing the final sentence of a policy draft, clicked the save icon, and closed the file. Then I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a cream envelope. Thin, deliberate, sealed. I held it out across the desk. No words, no explanation. Just the envelope. She stared at it, then at me. Her fingers hesitated for the briefest moment before she took it. I watched her open it. Her eyes scanned the letter. Her jaw tightened. Subject: termination of executive contract. Immediate effect. The contents were brief, formal, signed by both myself and the Haven plus West Board. It cited procedural violations, operational instability under her leadership, and executive-level negligence. But most importantly, it included the line I had insisted be printed without bold, without italics, without drama. Your role as interim chief brand officer is no longer required. Your contract is hereby terminated, effective immediately. She folded the letter slowly. For a moment, I thought she might speak. Plead, argue, flail. But she didn't. Perhaps even she knew when the performance was over. There was nothing left for her to do. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at her the way you look at a nameplate that's about to be unscrewed, no longer part of the architecture. Milana turned to leave. She paused at the threshold, glanced over her shoulder. Her voice was small. I thought I could do it. I thought I was supposed to. I didn't blink. You weren't. And that was it. She left without another word. No tears, no final monologue. No one watched her go. And when the door clicked shut behind her, the air in the room shifted, like a storm that had passed. I stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the city. The company was mine now. Not because I seized it, but because no one else had the hands steady enough to hold it. Justice had never been about spectacle. It had always been about knowing when the moment was done. Milana was finished, and I was just getting started. The hallway hadn't changed. Same polished floors. Same modern art that tried too hard. Same scent of expensive coffee and stale ambition lingering in the air vents. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked through it the last time. Back then, I had come in with hope, left with silence, and carried the weight of betrayal down these very steps. Now I walked back in with clarity. I wasn't here for ceremony. I was here for truth. The internal meeting had already started. Just another routine update scheduled in the large glass conference room where I had once been strategically transitioned, without ceremony, apology, or eye contact. The door was slightly ajar. They quieted when they saw me. I didn't rush. I stepped inside with the kind of calm that makes people instinctively sit up straighter. The air thickened. Someone stood. Someone else dropped a pen. Ms. Wells, I raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady the room. No theatrics, just intention. From the pocket of my blazer, I took out a small recorder. Sleek, black, the kind used for voice memos. And I pressed play. Their voices filled the room. Dylan's smooth executive cadence. Margaret's HR jargon. Milana's cool, dismissive tone. All of them echoed word for word from that morning. The one they thought would erase me. This is Milana. She'll be taking over your position starting Monday. We really appreciate your contributions. This won't take long. The room froze. Not just in embarrassment. In revelation. Some had never heard it before. Others had only whispered about it. But here it was. Undeniable. Uncut. Exactly how it had happened. I let it play. I let them feel the weight of it. Then I clicked it off. Silence. I placed the recorder gently on the table. Then I spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. I was fired here, in this very room. No explanation, no warning, no dignity. I let that sit. But I'm not here to relive that moment. I looked around at the faces. Executives, team leads, department heads, the new and the old. I'm here to lead, not as someone returning from defeat, but as someone who was never meant to be erased in the first place. No one moved. I walked to the head of the table. The very seat Dylan had occupied when he looked me in the eyes and cut me loose. I sat down, comfortably, without asking. From this moment on, I said, we rebuild. Honestly, relentlessly, and without fear. A beat passed. Then another. Someone nodded. Another adjusted their posture, eyes forward now, not sideways. They knew, they all knew. There were no cheers, no applause, only something better. Alignment. And in that quiet, powerful moment, Georgia Wells returned. Not as a ghost, not as a threat, but as the future they didn't know they'd been waiting for. Evening had fallen by the time the last department head left the floor. The building was quiet now, humming with the low static of exhausted systems winding down. Somewhere, a printer clicked. Somewhere else, lights dimmed by motion sensor. And I stood at the window. The skyline stretched endlessly before me. Glass towers bathed in city light. Streams of car headlights sliding through the arteries of a city that never cared who rose or fell inside its steel heart. But I cared, because I remembered what they tried to do to me here. How they looked me in the eye and spoke empty words. How they replaced me without reason, without hesitation, and called it vision. How they erased me from the calendar, the team chat, the org chart. Quietly, methodically. But I was still here. And they weren't. Not because I fought, not because I screamed, but because truth doesn't vanish when silence falls. It waits. And when the moment arrives, it steps back into the light. They tried to erase me. But you can't erase foundation. You can paint over it, rearrange the furniture, change the names on the walls, but the framework remains. Because true value, the kind that builds, uplifts, protects, can't be destroyed. It echoes. It roots itself. And when the storm passes, it's still standing, stronger, wiser, quietly waiting for its time. I never sought revenge, not once. That would have made me like them. No, I came back to restore. To reclaim what was stolen, not for ego, not even for justice, but because what we built mattered. And when something truly matters, you don't let it rot just because someone else walked away. I rebuilt. Not louder, just better. I forged something new, not from the rubble, but from the steel beneath it. In silence, in strength, in complete, unshakable confidence. Behind me, the office was no longer just an office. It was a blueprint for what could be, for what should have always been. And as I stood there, no applause, no speeches, just the golden dusk painting the city in light, I realized this was always where I belonged. Not on the sidelines, not in the shadows, but here, at the center, building something only I could build. And finally, being seen not as what they thought I was, but as who I've always been.